All right, let's make sure that everyone gets a copy first of Lord Holland's Seat Near Margate, Kent. So I'll pass this around the class. It's not in the text we're using, but you'll find it on the web CT. Those in the viewing audience. What would the public outcry be if a modern university appointed a man to a full professorship with salary and required no service of him? Imagine an academician receiving a salary of approximately $70,000 a year without having to deliver lectures or supervise students. In fact, without even being required to visit the campus during the tenure of his office. In many ways, the American education system is so far from the 18th century and continental educational systems that it's inconceivable that education could have been conducted this way. But such was the case with government-appointed professorships at both the University of Oxford and Cambridge during the greater part of the 18th century. They were not, of course, planned that way. And professors at Oxford often expressed their displeasure with Joseph Spence, who, as the professor of modern history at Oxford for 26 years, rarely appeared at Oxford, delivered no lectures, supervised no students, and preferred to live in his comfortable parsonages in Surrey, maintaining amicable relations with literary persons. Toward the end of July in 1768, the professor of modern history at Cambridge, Lawrence Brockett, died, leaving an important position open for a government appointment. The Duke of Grafton, prodded by Grey's friend and Grafton's private secretary, Stonehure, advanced Thomas Grey's claim for the position, and the king appointed Thomas Grey to fill that position, which for Grey meant a sinecure, a reward of some £400 per year for literary accomplishments, but a position that placed no demands on his time. The question which this course must concern itself with is, why does Thomas Grey deserve the professorship of modern history at Cambridge University? Furthermore, why does he remain an author worthy of study in the 18th century? Every high school student who studies English literature has heard the elegy written in a country churchyard and the plight of simple, humble folk. Far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife, their sober wishes never learned to stray. Along the cool, sequestered vale of life, they kept the noiseless tenor of their way. At least Thomas Hardy had apparently read Grey. He wrote far from the madding crowd. And perhaps Abraham Lincoln, too. For Grey, speaking of the poet, mindful of the unhonored dead, dost in these lines their artless tale relate. And finally, that famous statement all students remember, praising the virtue of moral living and warning them of the transitory nature and the futility of fame, pride, and power. The boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth e'er gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. At least 3 movies have been produced with the title, The Paths of Glory. We will have time later to study in detail Thomas Gray's Elegy. But it's not for this alone that he earned the admiration, the support of political figures. For in truth, he was part and parcel aware of past literary history. Remember, he held a professorship in modern history. There were no professors in literature in the 18th century. There were no professors of creative writing. People would have thought it rather odd to write about living right authors, as we do so handsomely as often today. He was a Latinist. He knew Latin. He was a philologist, and he studied exotic languages. He was in communication with the finest scholars in England, with Samuel Johnson, Thomas and Joseph Wharton, and Horace Walpole, son of Robert Walpole, who was interested in the exotic, interested in Eastern art, interested in Gothic literature. Gray did not publish a large body of poetry. It took him a long time to write poems. The Elegy in the Country Churchyard, some say, took almost 10 years. But there is a body of poetry worth looking at, and we'll mention a few of the items that he has written. In 1742, he wrote an ode on the spring. Just a simple work. And then he went to Eton College. He admired the college. He spoke about the aimless ways of school children and how it is best that they not know about the pain and old age and suffering they will endure. He wrote an ode on a distant prospect. He talks about how the school children would swim, how they would play ball on the margin green. And then he talks about how when they become adult, they will realize the real ravages of the world and the hazards of the world. But then he brushes it off. He says, no need to worry them today. Let them play. There's time enough for them to know what the world is really about. He wrote an ode on the death of a favorite cat, drowned in a tub of goldfishes. Now, you have that poem in your book, and I want to look at it very briefly because what you have is a classic ode in sestets. You have a number of stanzas, each with 6 lines, exactly 7 stanzas. Who knows, 7 could represent the 7 days of the week. 7 could represent the beginning of life and the end of life. 7 could represent a time sequence, and it does in this particular work. We find it. What happened actually was that Horace Walpole had a bowl and a goldfish in it. The cat climbed on it, fell in, and drowned. The goldfish bowl was later sold at auction. It rhymes, and let's look at the poem. It begins, "'Twas on a lofty vase's side, where China's gayest art had dyed the azure flowers that blow." Now, this was not a glass bowl. It was more of a translucent. It was more of a bowl with figurines painted on it, probably more of a porcelain. "Demurest of the tabby kind, The pensive Selma reclined and gazed on the lake below. Those of you who have orange-colored cats may picture this cat looking at the goldfish below. Again, I want to point out that the poet is very cautious about the way he writes. The rhymes are meaningful. For example, the first two rhymes say that on the side of the bull we have dyed flowers, right? And then we realize that the flowers blow, but the cat's not interested in these artificial flowers. He's more interested in what is, or she's more interested in what's below. So you now have two lines that rhyme, and they in fact trap or surround the central rhyme, which talks about some kind of animal acts in a certain way, and the kind is reclined. So if you study the verse and the rhyme patterns, you begin to get some idea of the themes of the poem. At any rate, here we have the cat looking at the goldfish. Stanza 2, her conscious tale, her joy declared, the fair round face, the snowy beard, the velvet of her paws, the coat that with a tortoise vies, her ears of jet and emerald eyes, she saw and purred applause. Cats. Stanley Breakage, who was an experimental film artist, died last year after a long career of experimental films. And one of the films he did was a short set on cats in Los Angeles after midnight. And he just followed these cats through the alleyways of Los Angeles. A whole movie just about cats at night. Her conscious tale, her joy declared. Now, the tail is not conscious of anything, right? It's the cat whose mind controls the tail. And now we have the perception. You see what you understand. Your mind activates your muscles. Lockean philosophy is at work. But this cat has instincts. She saw and purred applause. She's not going to clap her hands. So how do you celebrate your good fortune? Stanza 3. Still had she gazed, but midst the tide, two angel forms were seen to glide, the genii of the stream. And the metaphor for the fish becomes these abstract, exotic, oriental figures whom she's looking at. Their scaly armor is Tyrian hue. They are gold, and they've got scales. Therefore, they're wearing armor, and the armor is to protect them from their adversaries. Through richest purple to the view betrayed, through richest purple in the view betrayed a golden gleam, so that while you have a reflection off the water. They are gold, but they reflect other colors. Now, number 4, we get the history professor's work. He says, the hapless nymph with wonder saw. We already see she is hapless. Something is going to happen to her. Her history will be one of fate, not one of fortune. The hapless nymph with wonder saw a whisker first and then a claw. Now, how could she see a whisker and a claw when she's only looking at goldfish? Her reflection in the water, right. Here we get other Greek myths staring us in the face. The hapless nymph with wonder saw a whisker first and then a claw. With many an ardent wish she stretched in vain to reach the prize. Now he becomes philosophical about what it is that people, and particularly women, desire. What female heart can gold despise. If it's golden, it must be rich. Therefore, women want it. But then, if the poem ended just at that point, it would be a maudlin piece of metaphor. But then he gets realistic again. What cat's averse to fish? Comes down to earth, gives us the real tale here. The apostrophe, presumptuous maid, he addresses this cat who is not going to understand what's going to happen to her. With looks intent, again she stretched, again she bent, nor knew the gulf between. Malignant fate sat by and smiled. The slippery verge her feet beguiled. She tumbled headlong in. Now, gulf between and headlong in is an odd rhyme. But again, it's a matter of English pronunciation. Let's look at the rhyme. She is bent on her intent. Right? Stanza 5. I'm going to go a little backwards here. She is bent on her intent. Next, there's a gulf between which she will fall headlong in. And I guess we'll go gulf between and headlong in. We'll run the Irish a little bit. Fate forces her, and fate smiled and beguiled her. All right, next stanza. 8 times emerging from the flood, she mewed to every watery god. Some speedy aid to send. No dolphin came, and we're looking here at classical illusions. No dolphin came, no nereid stirred, nor cruel Tom, nor Harry heard. A favorite has no friend. When you're in trouble, no one will come to your aid. Why did she emerge only 8 times and mew only 8 times to every watery god? Yes, sir. She has 9 lives, and the 9th she doesn't come back up. He's very good, right? He's a good mathematician. He's got to figure it out. The poem leaves nothing to your imagination other than what happens to cats when they go in the water. Now, of course, the poem ends with its peroration, with the theme, with a summary. From hence, ye beauties. Now he's talking to all the women in the world. From hence, ye beauties undeceived. No, one false step is ne'er retrieved. And be with caution bold. So now he's warning these women that they can lose their virtue if they become attracted to a man who will lure them in and force them to lose their lives or their virtue. Last 3 lines. Not all that tempts your wandering eyes and heedless hearts is lawful prize. Not all that glitters gold. Any comments about this poem? What does the poem say? Is it just a piece of trivia? Or does it show an artist's work trying to paint a picture about the reality of human life? Because he's not asking that the cat stay alive. He's really asking the human beings stay alive. Any suggestions? Ms. Schilling? Mr. Tate? Yes, sir.
I think it's a really good allegory for lessons that everyone needs to learn, not necessarily just women, but when he says, from hence ye beauties undeceived, I take that to mean not necessarily women, but just the naive individuals of the world for one false step is ne'er retrieved.
So it applies to all people and not just to the cat. But it's a relatively clever poem, and it's a poem that, again, gives us themes from the rhymes. Let's look at the themes in the last stanza, where we have, "You are undeceived, and you can't be retrieved." "Don't be bold for gold. Your eyes may give you a prize or may lose a prize for you." Again, the themes of the poem can be derived from the poem itself. Gray wrote a poem called The Progress of Palsy, where he discusses what poets are, who they are, how they write great poetry. And this is a Pindaric ode. A Pindaric ode generally consists of 3 major stanzas: an epode, a strophe, and an antistrophe. A strophe, an antistrophe, and an epode. First you have the theme expressed in the strophe, then you have alternate themes or counter themes in the antistrophe, and then you have the sententious statement made in the epode when the chorus stands still. So the Pindaric ode generally is in 3 stanzas, and you have multiples of 3s, 3s, 6, 9s. And the Progress of Palsy we will not look at, but it's worth your time, and certainly worth your time if you want to write a research paper about a significant piece of writing. There are a number of Gothic poems, Norse poems that deal with northern climates, Gothic climates, that Gray deals with. Among them, the Bard, the Fatal Sisters, the Descent of Odin. This is his study of classical and exotic languages, and the Triumphs of Owen. But we're going to spend some time now looking at his most memorable poem, and that is the Elegy written in the country churchyard. He started it about the year 1742 and gave a copy of it to Horace Walpole. Let's just move that up. He gave a copy to Horace Walpole, and that's the son of the Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, in 1750. It was published on February 15th in 1751, and by 1763 it had gone into 12 separate editions, which is quite a bit of popularity, a widely popular poem. So let us spend some time now talking about the Elegy in the country churchyard. As a professor of history, Thomas Gray proved his interest in the manners of men and the passage of time. He concerned himself with the ways in which men might best utilize their time on earth. He appears convinced that one's present conduct bears a message for future generations. The elegy, written in the country churchyard, names historical figures and addresses the general populace. The Progress of Poetry celebrates genius and identifies England's most famous writers. The Bard introduces historical figures and poets, some real and some fictitious. Gray's poetic style serves to present his ideas in a manner designed to impress these lessons upon the reader. His rhetoric, his diction, his rhythm, his rhymes, his imagery, all are important to give us an idea of the nature of history. The elegy, written in the country churchyard, was very popular throughout the years. It has been pirated, imitated, quoted, translated into both Latin and Greek, and parodied. Gray showed it to friends 5 years before it was published. He wanted their opinions about it. He wasn't afraid to hear what they had to say. But to appreciate the full importance of this poem, you must first understand the purpose of an elegy, a classical form that's important in both Latin and Greek literature. Originally, the word elegy meant almost any type of serious, subjective meditation on the part of the poet, whether the subject concerned itself with death, love, or war. Throughout the 18th century, however, the elegy dealt with death as its major motif. But more important, the poem deals with the passage of time. How are people going to spend their time, and what happens to them? We're going to see movement from birth to old age. We're going to see the changing of the seasons. We're going to see cyclical patterns of life. We're going to see autumn for middle age, winter for old age. To understand this poem, it's necessary to divide it into parts, simply to be aware of the different experiences it really relates. And so I'm going to spend some time on that. Let's look at the parts of this particular poem. If you look at stanzas 1 to 3, you're going to deal with dusk and the end of day. What happens to people when it's time to go to sleep or time to bring in the cattle. Stanzas 4 to 5 deal with the realization of death. Death is going to come just as dusk turns into night. Stanzas 6 to 7, we talk about the humble lives of the dead. And we'll look at some of these figures in a few moments. Stanzas 8 to 11, remember the purpose of history is to help us understand human nature and to prevent the faults of the past. We're dealing here with the insolence, pride, and man's common lot in death. The insolence of pride. If you're prideful, you're not going to understand where you really begin. Stanzas 12 to 20 give us the potential of human life. And we're dealing here with honor, but also shame, for those who don't live a life of honor. Stanzas 21 to 23 give us a memorial stone and its purpose. Why do you set up a memorial stone to one's friend? And does someone who is dead still have his friends looking after him? Stanzas 24 to 29 give us the poet's commentary on his own fate. And finally, stanzas. The last stanza is the epitaph, where we have a tribute to a dead friend in the grave. If you check closely, you'll recognize three major movements in the poem. First, there's the identification of the graveyard with statements about those buried therein. Secondly, there's a personal identification where the poet contemplates his own remembrance after death, or about death. And finally, we have the epitaph at the end, which, though written for a friend, may be the poet's hope that some friend may write the same for him. There are many ways that people have attempted to explain this poem. Some find a hidden stone carver in the poem about whom the epitaph itself is written. When you realize that Gray receives his position at Cambridge on the advice of a friend by the name of Stone Hewer, that becomes a suspect. Some feel the poem is a tribute to Gray's friend Richard West. Basically, I feel it is a poem about the way people should live while alive, and the graveyard is only the matrix affording the poet the opportunity to state this position. Now, having outlined briefly the structural elements of this poem, we're going to look at some other elements that give the poem a central type of unity. The poem deals with cyclical time, the daily event, the diurnal movement. It also deals with chronological or longitudinal time, calendar days. Both diurnal time and chronological time are stated in this poem. At the beginning, the reader notes that the day is ending. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. And it details the movements of the farmer and the shepherd. But where is day? We know the day is parting. What images do we have of the parting day? In the grave note, the forefathers shall never again hear the breezy call of incense-breathing morn. So if you're in the grave, you'll never hear you'll never breathe the morning air again. That's where day appears, from out of the grave. While in the grave, we have young men, perhaps the poet, cautious in the graveyard. At the peep of dawn, they brush with hasty steps the dews away. So when you get up early in the morning, you get these signs of day. Daytime and nighttime images are important in the poem. Historical time is important too. How does he get into history in this poem? Well, first we know that in these graves, the rude forefathers of the hamlet sleep. Now the word rude does not mean impolite. Rude means ruddy. They've been working in the fields and their necks are red. The rude forefathers of the hamlet sleep. Those are the men who founded the town. their children and children's children. History becomes important when we realize that these people in the grave might themselves have become noteworthy. If circumstances were right, if they had gotten an education, but most of them were just farmers and country folk. One could have been like Milton, the 17th century blind poet, or Oliver Cromwell, the head of the Commonwealth government from 1642 to 1659. And there are classical and biblical origins to the past. Lines 61 to 64 talk about senates. Presumably we're looking at the history of Roman senates. And then we discover that these farmers enjoy plenty over a smiling land. Whenever you see a land smiling, or whenever you see a land laughing, you know it's biblical. And again, as I said the other day, the word laughter is translated into the Hebrew word Isaac. And Sarah laughed when she discovered she was, at the age of 90, going to have a child. And she laughed. Her pregnancy became a cause for regeneration, rebirth, just as anyone planting a seed in the ground expects the rebirth and the regeneration of plants from the ground. Time is also evidenced in animal life in this poem. In the daytime creatures and the nocturnal creatures, the incessant drone of the beetle, noticeable at night in the woods, and the owl complaining to the moon, are differentiated from the swallow twittering from the straw-built shed and the cock's shrill clarion. So you have night animals and day animals. You're always conscious of the dichotomy. And then we see the team that off the stubborn glebe has broke. The animals are out plowing the fields during the day. But at the heart of the poem and its central motif are those images that depict the honesty and humility of those in the grave, contrasted with the powerful and the mighty and the proud. What are the qualities of life that the poet celebrates in this poem? Well, these two can be grouped thematically. Let's see what he talks about here. First of all, stanza 1 gives us industry, people work, people thriving, people farming, people trying to produce the food that makes the nation great. Stanza 6 deals with love of family. Those in the grave are memorable to the family, and their deaths sadden the family. Stanza 7 says life goes on, and so we're dealing with resolution to move ahead and good spirit. Stanza 17, mercy. How does one show mercy? He doesn't quite say it, but we'll see that it's by implication. Stanza 19 deals with sobriety. How do you maintain your serious nature? How do you attain and obtain and maintain your modesty? Stanza 23 deals with piety. And of course, the epitaph deals with friendship. These are major themes in this particular poem. The poet achieves an understanding of the virtue of these traits by citing them within the context of unacceptable opposites, by contrasting the lot of these village folk with others who blush of ingenuous shame, or heap the shrine of luxury and pride with incense kindled at the muse's flame. The reader is invited to correct vice with virtue. The poet also asks that ambitious people understand that these village people are humble, quiet. They ought not be disturbed. They ought not be blamed. And he says in lines 29 to 30, let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys and destiny obscure. They're not going to achieve fame, but don't make fun of them just because they're impoverished and just because they're ill-educated. Again, what are the results of pomp and power? The boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth e'er gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. Now, the poet has a problem. And always he's a realist. He recognizes that men are subject to the limitations of human experience. He realizes that the men he celebrates, the simple and the poor, have remained so, have really failed to identify themselves with the mainstream events of historical action because they've not been given opportunities. Why are they poor and humble? Because they didn't have the chance to be proud and rich. Why are they moral? Because they never had the opportunity to be immoral. So he doesn't know how many of these people would have been corrupted by the realities of life. Consequently and antithetically, they have not had the opportunity to celebrate their fullest potential. And you look at lines 45 to 48. Perhaps in this neglected spot is laid some heart once pregnant with celestial fire, some writer who could give us great poetry. Hands that the roar, people who could lead the nation. Hands that the rod of empire might have swayed, or waked to ecstasy the living lyre. There may have been genius here, never developed. Thus, while remaining innocent, they've not been able to develop their potential. The future statesman never entered an election. The soldier never led troops. The potential poet never found time to write. The musician never time to sing. Sequestered in this hidden veil, apart from the sources of learning and government, impoverished by their circumstances, they found little time for study. But knowledge, to their eyes, her ample page, rich with the spoils of time, did never unroll. Chill penury, just poverty. Chill penury repressed their noble rage and froze the genial current of the soul. They were poor. All they were doing was trying to eke out a living. They had no time for these exotic circumstances of life. Go to Appalachia, go to West Virginia and Kentucky, go to the swampland of Louisiana, and search for the educators and poets. They're almost non-existent. Too busy eking out a barren living to apply themselves to philosophy or art. D.H. Lawrence, writing of the myth of the early American, asks why so few women are celebrated in early literature, particularly in frontier stories. His response, the frontier woman, poor drudge, was too busy pounding dirty clothes on rocks along the riverbank to devote herself to the muses. Thus, among these people who might have flourished in a cultural milieu, there are no Hampdens, the English statesman and patriot, who resisted Charles I. If, as Emerson later was to say, all ills have compensating virtues, the other side of the story is that these innocents, not subject to public life or public pressure, are not likely to commit the crimes that the great people actually commit. What is best, asks the poet, to enable the fruition of potential with the benefits that might accrue to the disasters one might hazard, or to allow persons in innocence to celebrate the simple essentials of human existence. The poet celebrates peace and serenity so that men can be charitable toward each other. Far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife, their sober wishes never learn to stray. Along the cool sequestered vale of life, they kept the noiseless tenor of their way. Now, this poem is memorable for many reasons. First, the poet has simplified his rhyme patterns and his rhyme scheme. He follows a conventional iambic pentameter rhythm with a conventional AB-AB rhyme scheme. For example, in the second stanza, one would strike hard on 5 syllables: fades, glim, land, on, and sight. The strong last syllable suggests meaning at the end of each line. Sight rhymes with flight. Holds rhymes with folds. The rhymes are very significant in trying to help us understand these themes. One remembers the poem by recalling the lines that have been immortalized in literature. Far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife. And Abraham Lincoln's words when he spoke at Gettysburg, mindful of the unhonored dead, are certainly taken from this poem. In the elegiac tradition, this poem memorializes time and its meaning to humankind who are in this world for a short space of time. The melancholy tone of the poem, like Milton's Il Penseroso, states that we find fortune and we find hope and we find true expression in each individual's reactions to his surroundings. And that natural existence may be least prone to immoral behavior or the pressures of immoral political conduct. I've mentioned to you that Gray was a poet of history. I want to look at another poem right now that's not in your text, but I've distributed to you a copy of this poem, and you will have it in you will see it in WebCT. It's called Lord Holland's Seat near Margate, Kent. This is ultimate corruption. And as an historian, he's somewhat glad that these people in the graveyard haven't had the opportunity to experience what George Vaux has brought upon England. And this is Thomas Gray's poem on he might have been censored had he spelled out the person's whole name. So we fill in Lord Holland. Now it's important to recognize in this poem that, by the way, it's first printed anonymously, because it is an attack on a political figure and a powerful figure. We're talking about Henry Fox. Henry Fox was the first Lord Holland. He lived from 1705 to 1754. He was Secretary of State, paymaster of the general, so he got very rich. He was an ally of the Earl of Bute, but he was deserted by his political friends when he attacked some of his followers, people like Rigby, Richard Rigby, William Petty Fitzmaurice, the Earl of Shelburne, and John Calcraft, who was an unsavory politician. So the poem is really an attack on, I'll just put the names in here, Rigby, Shelburne, and Calcraft. And the poet really wants to prove how vicious they are, and how when a friend needs them, they're unwilling to help. Now, Fox lived in the south, near Kingsgate, near Margate, and he was one of these people who decided to shape his garden as though it were a historical site. And so if you walk through his garden, you would see a castle erected. Not a castle, but really the facade of a castle, supported with wooden beams, but you wouldn't see the beams. But you would see the ruins of a castle. You might see a facade where there were, of other buildings. You might see a battlefield. You might see weapons thrown about in the field. You might see classical gardens. In other words, you have a garden that reminds you of historical events. You might see a marble bust of a Roman emperor. You might see a chariot representative of Roman days. So he had this garden, and by the way, it's quite classical. There was a man by the name of Shenstone who created a garden called Lessos. And if you walk through the garden, you would move in different directions. You might see a classical Roman bridge. I'm trying to think of the name of the architect. Vitruvius. You might see a Vitruvius bridge. You might see a classical building that had a dome on it in ruins, because this is what happens to buildings in history. Now, there was a petition against Holland, Lord Holland, Henry Fox, who was responsible for the loss of unaccounted millions of dollars. We have companies that have gone into Iraq, and they're being blamed for profiteering, from charging too much for military meals or uniforms or trucks. By the way, it's very possible that we don't have enough troops over there right now, because we don't have enough troops to protect our troops. You always have to have enough troops to fight and enough to protect them. We have enough to fight, but not enough to protect. So some people are complaining that we're spending unaccounted millions of dollars overseas. You don't know where the money's going, but it is disappearing. Now, as Paymaster General, Lord Fox had a good opportunity to steal a great deal of money. All the Paymaster Generals became quite wealthy. Why? Because they were given money by the state to form, let's say, 10 regiments. If they formed only 9, who knew what happened to the money for the 10th regiment? When a person died overseas, it took 6 months for the news to come back. What happened to his paychecks during those months? when they recovered. Where did the money go? The paymaster generals took them. They absorbed them. Who knows what corruption? When I was a teenager, I was an usher at an outdoor theater, and we used to put the tarps on the seats to protect the seats from rain and take them off before the show. And there were about 8 of us on the crew, and we always saw 10 names on the roster. 10 people were being paid, but we only could figure out 8 people working. So we figured that 2 names on the list were paybacks either to the supervisor, the boss, or someone else who wanted his family on the payroll without working. We worked anyway. You only needed 8 people to put on the tarps. So as Paymaster General, Lord Fox could get very rich, and Pope tells us of Paymaster Generals who became quite rich as well. Now let's see how this poem operates. It's ironic because we have Lord Holland himself talking. Now, again, I keep talking about rhyme schemes and the way the rhyme works. Friend seeks to mend. People have a resolution, and the question is whether they have a strong constitution to live up to this resolution. People make choices. They can rejoice. They can live on sand, and they can hope to land there or not. In this case, these are opposites. Keep going down the line, and you'll see how this poem develops. There are vultures that are going to feast. Well, the east is blighted. Vultures are going to feast on it. And notice that as battlements arise, people delude their eyes. Friendships are vain because people pretend to be friends. And what is vain, they feign. Notice, the rhymes as you go down become meaningful to the poem. All right. Here is Lord Holland complaining about the fact that he's been thrown out of office because his friends wouldn't support him, and they accused him of stealing the millions that probably some of them themselves had stolen. He starts out, the poet. Old and abandoned by each venal friend, here Holland took the pious resolution to smuggle some few years and strive to mend a broken character and constitution. His life's gone. On this congenial spot, he fixed his choice. He's built a house, a home, and a garden. This garden with the historical remnants on it. He built a home near the home of Earl Godwin, who was a medieval hero to the English. On this congenial spot, he fixed his choice. Earl Godwin trembled for his neighboring sand. Here seagulls scream and cormorants rejoice, and mariners, though shipwrecked, dread to land. Here reign the blustering north and blighting east. No tree is heard to whisper, bird to sing. Yet nature cannot furnish out the feast. Art he invokes, new horrors still to bring. So that you're going to have this garden that's going to show these relics. Now mouldering fanes and battlements arise, arches and turrets nodding to their fall. Unpeopled palaces delude his eyes, and mimic desolation covers all. He's pretending that all this is a picture of this garden of historical relics of past wars and past events. Oh, said the sighing peer, had Bute been true, no Shelburne's, Rigby's, Callicraft's friendship vine, far other scenes than these had blessed our view, and where lies the ruins that we feign? Now, what would he like to see really happen to England if he had still been in power? Purged by the sword and beautified by fire, then had we seen proud London's heighted walls, owls might have hooted in St. Peter's choir, and foxes stunk and littered in St. Paul's. Well, St. Paul's Cathedral is the seat of the Anglican Church, to some extent in London. And when he says, we'll take over not only the city and not only the countryside, we'll take over the churches. And we will corrupt the churches and see them stink. And foxes stunk and littered St. Paul's. Now, what fox would litter St. Paul's? Who would ruin the religious morality of the society if he was still in power? Who? Button? Anyone?
Would it be Henry Fox?
Exactly. So the poet Gray has taken the word of the name of a predator, adapted it to Fox himself, and turned the poem into a poem, into an illustration of the ruin that comes when corrupt politicians decimate the morality and the fiber of the country. Magnificent poem. Why don't we have poets writing poems like this? Do we have politicians we no longer... do we like all our politicians? I mean... But why aren't our poets writing these poems? Why don't we have people writing poems about the Secretary? Said, yes. Where are our poets? Where are their voices?
I think because of the First Amendment, freedom of speech, so really our government couldn't kill them if they said something bad about them. I mean...
So why don't they express their opinion? Why don't they come out and deal with the politicians of today the way Gray dealt with Fox? In Gray's day, you had censorship. Of course, he published his poem anonymously, yes.
Well, if you look what happens today when anybody questions our country's, quote-unquote morality, I think there's still a very grave danger in pushing that envelope. Unless you are working in film or theater, something that's very well protected, if you're using a smaller venue like poetry, it's tougher to get your opinions out because the moral right in our country won't allow that to happen, basically.
So in a free country, we have less free expression than we might otherwise. Yes, Dr. Nunes.
Well, you just acknowledged that in the movies. Did you hear Jay Leno last night making fun of the president? No, he's not a poet. It's not the poets who are doing it. It's the people who have the more publicity than poets have.
All right.
Which you said.
So have the comedians superseded the poets? Have the poets arrogated their responsibility to our comedians, to our stand-up club jokesters? All right. We have to have the buttons. I can hear you, but the audience outside can't hear you. Yes, sir.
I was just going to say, people write songs about it. I mean, it's in a lot of music. So, I mean, that's a form of poetry. I mean, if you want to look at it that way. It is. Can you name a song offhand? Just. All right, but it's a good start. Yeah, I suppose you could compare, take the songwriters and see what they're saying. We know that the songwriters, Pete Seeger and some earlier ones in the Depression days were writing. Who's writing about contemporary events in Washington? Mr. Hallmark?
I think what it is mainly entertainment venues. Mainly they make fun of politicians using sarcasm and speculation. it's not exact or direct attacks. But with poetry and people who write literature, they do extensive research and they make clever quips and more logical and truthful accusations that can be backed up.
All right, but we don't have many poets doing it in this country. We have foreign poets doing it. We have poets in Poland, we have poets in Africa, poets in Afghanistan, but where are the American poets? Yes, sir.
But look what happens when you do speak out on that. I mean, if hip hop and rap is the modern poetry that my culture has accepted, look what happens when you come out and speak out against injustices. Take Eminem. What happens to him when he makes any statement about our government is he gets an entire government lobby to waste time in Congress talking about how terrible he is. I mean, there is no free speech in this country if you are attempting to be subversive in any way to our nation's government.
And being subversive, of course, is a subjective statement. We always hope that there will be an opposition. We haven't had time really to look at the progress of poesy, but I want you to look very quickly on page 976. I'm sorry, 753. All right. Go to stanza 3, Canto 3, verse 2. Go to the stanza that begins, nor second he. All right, first, go to 3:1. You see Roman numeral 3 and 1. What poet is he mentioning here? Far from the sun and summer gale, in thy green lap was nature's darling laid. What time where lucid Avon strayed, to him the mighty mother did unveil her awful face. And he speaks about how this poet deals with tragedy. What poet are we talking about there? Shakespeare at Avon. Go down to number 3:2. Nor second he that rode sublime upon the seraph wings of ecstasy. What poet? Milton, dealing with angels. Next, he does mention specifically at line 105, behold where Dryden's less presumptuous ear wide o'er the fields of glory bear. And then he goes down to stanza 3:3, where he discusses the Theban eagle. Who is the Theban eagle who celebrates, who's a poet and whose poetry soars because it is Greek rhapsodic lyrical poetry? Pindar, right. The Theban eagle is always Pindar. So this professor of history knows his metaphors, he knows his allegories, he knows his history, and he knows public sentiment. Thank you.